Life had already taken almost everything from an 11-year-old girl named Lila, her mother, her safety, her childhood. But on one unforgettable morning, as she searched for scraps along a dusty road, she heard a faint cry coming from a black trash bag. Inside was a dying lion cub, barely 2 months old, tossed away like worthless garbage. In that single moment, two broken lives collided in the most unexpected way, setting off a chain of events no one could have imagined. If you want to know what incredible miracle unfolded between this little girl and the dying lion cub she found, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single emotional moment of what happens next. Lila had learned, far earlier than any child should, that life demanded more than it ever gave. At 11 years old, she moved through the world with the quiet resilience of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. Her home was a crooked shack pieced together from rusted metal sheets, scraps of wood, and tarps bleached by the unrelenting African sun. When the wind blew hard, the entire structure trembled, as if deciding whether to stay standing or surrender to the dust. Every morning, Lila woke to the sound of her father rummaging for the bottle he had fallen asleep beside. She would lie still, holding her breath, waiting to hear whether he was in a rage or simply too hungover to care. Most days, he didn't speak to her at all. On the days he did, his words were sharp enough to cut. Her mother had been the warmth of the shack, but after she died 3 years earlier, the warmth had died with her. What remained was silence, broken only by the clinking of empty bottles and the distant calls of wildlife drifting in from the border of the nearby reserve. Lila's mornings were always the same. She washed her face with water she had saved in a cracked plastic bucket. She tied back her tangled hair with a shoelace she had found months ago. Then she grabbed the frayed sack she used for collecting scraps and headed out before her father could find a reason to stop her. The village children rarely spoke to her. Some pitied her, others mocked her, but all kept their distance. Poverty had a scent, and Lila carried it with her everywhere she went. Still, she walked with purpose. She knew every path that wound between the shacks and trash piles. She knew where the shopkeepers dumped broken crates, where travelers left behind bottles near the bus stop, and which dusty corners of the village yielded the best chance of finding something she could sell. Her bare feet were toughened by years of walking over gravel and dry thorns. Her hands were small but quick, her eyes sharp enough to spot anything others had missed. Yet, despite the hardness of her life, there was a gentleness inside her that refused to fade. She knelt to straighten a beetle flipped on its back. She left crumbs of her own meager food for stray dogs. She paused to watch the birds circling above the savanna, imagining what it would feel like to be that free. These small acts didn't change her world, but they reminded her she still had a heart, even if life had given her little reason to use it. The sun had barely risen when she set out that day. The sky glowed with the faint pink of early dawn, and the air still held the coolness of night. Lila walked toward the dirt road that bordered the reserve, dragging her sack behind her. She knew she could find more valuable scraps there. Sometimes buses passed through, and people threw out bottles or cans. Sometimes tourists dropped things, unaware of how precious even a cracked plastic water jug could be to a girl like her. As she walked, she hummed a tune her mother used to sing. It was the one piece of her mother she could still hold on to, the one thing her father had never managed to break. The melody wrapped around her like a memory of safety she no longer had. She didn't know it yet. But this morning, the path she had walked 1,000 times would lead her to something that would change everything she believed about life, about love, and about the fragile line between survival and hope. And it would begin with a sound so faint she almost missed it. The road along the edge of the reserve was quiet that morning. touched only by the soft whispers of wind brushing through dry grass. Lila walked slowly, scanning the ground with the instinct of someone who had spent years searching for things others had thrown away. The sky had fully opened into a pale gold, promising another scorching day ahead. She tightened her grip on the strap of her sack and stepped around a broken crate half buried in dust. She was about to move on when a faint, almost imperceptible sound cut through the stillness. At first, she thought it was the distant mew of a bird or the whimper of a stray dog. But when she paused, the sound came again, thinner, weaker, as if whatever made it was running out of strength. Lila frowned and tilted her head, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from behind a mound of discarded trash near the old fence post. Curiosity tugged at her. She stepped closer, her bare feet stirring little clouds of dust. The smell of rotten food and damp cloth made her wrinkle her nose, but she pushed forward anyway. She had heard many strange noises near the reserve's border before, but never something like this. It was a cry soft, trembling, and full of pain. She reached the pile and crouched down. There, tucked between torn cardboard and a rusted metal bucket, lay a black plastic trash bag knotted at the top. The sound came from inside it, a fragile, stuttering whimper that made Lila's chest tighten. Her breath caught as a sudden fear rushed through her. Whatever was inside was alive. With trembling fingers, she pulled the bag toward her. It was surprisingly light, far too light for anything human. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she fumbled with the knot, her hands shaking so badly she had to try twice before it loosened. When she finally opened the top of the bag, the world seemed to stop moving. Inside, curled into a limp ball of fur, was a tiny lion cub. Its tawny coat was dull, matted with dirt and streaks of dried blood. Its ribs were visible beneath its skin, each breath a desperate shudder. Its eyes, barely open, glistened with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The cub let out another thin cry, so quiet it might have been mistaken for a sigh. Lila froze. She had seen lions from afar, majestic creatures roaming near the reserve's boundaries. But she had never imagined touching one, much less finding a newborn abandoned like garbage. She knew enough to understand that cubs this young were never alone. They remained close to their mothers, protected by a pride. A cub without its mother meant only one thing, and the thought made her stomach twist. Someone had thrown it away. Her throat tightened painfully. She reached inside the bag with cautious hands and lifted the cub out, cradling it against her chest. It was frighteningly cold, its body floppy and fragile like a broken doll. Lila's heart raced as she pressed it closer, trying to give it warmth. The cub tried to lift its head but lacked the strength. It simply collapsed against her shirt, breathing in thin, uneven wheezes. For a moment, Lila forgot about the world around her, the scorching sun, her empty stomach, her father waiting with resentment and liquor. All she could see was this little life slipping away in her arms. Something deep inside her cracked open, a fierce surge of protectiveness rising in a way she had not felt since her mother died. She stood up slowly, tightening her grip on the cub. She didn't know how to save it. She didn't know where to go or who would help her. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She could not leave it here. Not to die. Not alone. Not like this. She turned toward the village and began to run. Lila ran as if the earth beneath her feet were collapsing. The cub's shallow breaths warmed her chest through her thin shirt, each one weaker than the last. She held it tightly, terrified that if she loosened her grip even for a second, the tiny creature would slip from her arms and fade away forever. Dust rose in soft clouds around her legs as she sprinted down the dirt road toward the village. Her lungs burned. Her throat scraped with each gasp. But she didn't stop. She reached the outskirts of the market first. Several vendors were setting up their stalls, arranging fruit, second-hand clothes, and trinkets warmed by the rising sun. Lila darted toward the nearest stall, nearly stumbling as her legs trembled from the effort. "Please," she cried, struggling to catch her breath. "Do you know anyone who can help?" The vendor, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, glanced down, expecting to see a wounded dog or perhaps a kitten. When he saw the lion cub, his expression hardened instantly. He stepped back, as though she carried a curse. "Get that thing away from here," he snapped. "It will bring trouble." "But it's dying," Lila pleaded. "I just need anyone who knows what to do." The man shook his head and turned away. Another vendor overheard her and shouted for her to leave before she attracted predators or the authorities. A woman hissed that the cub was bad luck and demanded Lila take it elsewhere. Fear rippled through her, but she clutched the cub closer and forced herself to keep moving. She knew of one person who might help. A retired nurse named Miriam lived near the far edge of the village, a woman her mother used to visit for herbs and remedies. Lila hadn't spoken to her in years, but she had no other choice. She pushed herself back into a run. By the time she reached Miriam's small hut, Lila was shaking. Sweat dripped down her back, her breath coming in choking bursts. She knocked frantically. "Miriam," she called, her voice cracking. "Please, I need help." The door opened slightly. Miriam's lined face appeared, her expression softening at the sight of Lila until she noticed the cub. Then the softness vanished, replaced by alarm. "Where did you get that?" "In a trash bag," Lila said, swallowing hard. "Please, it's cold. It can't breathe right." "Tell me what to do." Miriam hesitated only a moment before opening the door wider. "Bring it inside." Lila followed her in, gently laying the cub on a folded cloth Miriam placed on the floor. The hut smelled of herbs and dried leaves. Miriam knelt beside the cub, her hands quick and steady as she examined the tiny body. "It's severely dehydrated," she murmured, "and malnourished. It won't survive long like this." "Can you save it?" "I can try," Miriam said, "but I don't have what it needs. You must take it to the wildlife rescue outpost. They have supplies, milk, medicine." Lila's heart sank. The outpost was miles away, beyond the reserve's border. She had never traveled that far. "I can't get there," she whispered. "My father, he won't let me go." Miriam looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear beneath the determination. "Then you must choose what matters more," she said gently. "This little one's life depends on someone brave enough to stand for it." The cub whimpered, a thin, broken sound. Something inside Lila steeled. "I'll go," she said. Miriam poured warm water into a cup and added a pinch of something bitter-smelling. She handed it to Lila. "Let it drink tiny drops on your fingers as you walk. Keep it warm. Don't stop." Lila nodded, lifting the cub again, feeling how limp it had become. She tucked it under her shirt, close to her skin, trying to give it whatever warmth she had left. As she stepped outside, the sun had risen high, turning the earth into a burning plate. Lila's legs ached, her chest felt hollow, but she forced herself forward, one step at a time. She whispered to the cub as she walked. Words of comfort, words of hope, words she wished someone would whisper to her. "You're not trash," she said softly. "You're not alone. I won't let you die." The reserve outpost was still far away, but Lila kept walking because she knew what death felt like. She had felt it the day her mother left her, and she would not let this small, broken creature feel it alone. By the time Lila reached the wildlife rescue outpost, her legs felt like they were made of lead. The walk had taken hours under a brutal sun that scorched the earth into a shimmering haze. Every few minutes, she checked the cub tucked against her chest, terrified she might feel it go still. But each time she pressed her hand lightly against its tiny ribs, she felt the faint, frail rhythm of life, uneven, but still fighting. The outpost was a small compound of metal trailers, surrounded by tall fencing and signs warning trespassers to keep out. Lila hesitated at the entrance, unsure if she even had the right to be there, but when the cub let out a weak cry, she pushed the gate open and stumbled through. A man in a khaki vest stepped out of one of the trailers. He stood tall, with weathered skin and sharp, perceptive eyes that immediately noticed the bundle in her arms. "What do you have there?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Lila swallowed hard. "A lion cub," she whispered. "I found it in a trash bag." The man's expression shifted instantly. He walked toward her quickly, motioning for her to come inside. "I'm Dr. Mason. Bring it here." Inside the trailer, cool air hit her skin, and she shivered, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Mason cleared a space on a metal table and gently lifted the cub from her arms. Lila felt emptier the moment his hands replaced hers. Mason examined the cub with swift precision, checking its gums, feeling its abdomen, inspecting the wounds matted in its fur. His jaw tightened. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly. "Someone did this on purpose." Lila's stomach twisted. "Why would anyone hurt a baby?" Mason exhaled slowly, leaning back against the counter. "Poachers," he said. "They target prides near the reserve. The mothers are killed for their skins, bones, and teeth. The cubs, they're considered useless. They can't be sold, so sometimes they're left behind. Sometimes," he added with a bitterness that startled Lila, "they're stuffed into bags like trash." The words hit her like a blow. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She thought of the cub's tiny body shaking, alone in the darkness of that bag. She thought of its mother, strong, fierce, alive one moment, gone the next. "That's why it was thrown away," Lila whispered. "Because it had no use." Mason nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so." A deep sorrow filled her chest, heavier than anything she had carried before. She remembered the nights she had heard her father muttering that she was a burden, a mouth he couldn't afford to feed. She remembered how easily people discarded things they saw as worthless. The cub was like her, and that realization made her heart ache. "Can you save it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mason met her eyes. "I'll do everything I can. It's severely dehydrated and malnourished, but you brought it here before it crashed completely. That may have saved its life." Lila stood silently as Mason prepared an IV line, mixing formula, warming fluids. She watched his hands move with a calm certainty she envied. He worked the way her mother used to, focused, steady, full of quiet strength. After several long minutes, the cub finally began to drink small drops of formula from a syringe. Its eyes flickered, still weak, but no longer dull. A tiny spark of hope lit inside Lila. "You did the right thing bringing it here," Mason said. "Most children would have run away. Many adults, too." Lila looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly, still covered in dust. "I couldn't leave it," she said. "Not after seeing it like that." Mason studied her for a moment, then nodded with a softness that felt foreign in such a harsh world. "Sometimes," he said, "the smallest act of courage is enough to change a life." Lila didn't know yet that it wasn't just the cub's life that had changed. It was hers, too. When Lila returned to the village later that afternoon, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. She walked with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, her arms feeling strangely empty without the cub nestled against her chest. But as she approached the cluster of shacks, a familiar dread twisted in her stomach. She knew her father would have noticed her absence. She knew he would not let it pass quietly. Sure enough, when she reached their shack, her father was waiting outside, leaning against the doorway, with a bottle hanging loosely from his hand. His eyes were already narrowed. His jaw set in a way that made Lila's pulse quicken. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice raspy and uneven. Lila swallowed hard. "I found an animal that needed help. I took it to the outpost." "A lion cub," someone nearby muttered, loud enough for the whole group of onlookers to hear. Her father stiffened. "A lion cub? You brought a cursed creature into this village?" His lip curled, not with fear but with opportunity. "Do you know what people pay for something like that? Poachers would give good money, and we're starving." A small crowd had gathered, neighbors drawn by the smell of conflict. Some shook their heads at Lila, others whispered about danger, bad luck, spirits angered by touching a wild animal. Lila felt all their eyes on her, heavy with judgment. "You should have brought it here," her father snapped. "I could have sold it before the sun went down." "No," Lila said, her voice trembling but firm. "It was dying. It needed help." Her father's face twisted with anger. "Help? Help doesn't fill our stomachs. Help doesn't put a roof over our heads." He took a step toward her, raising his hand, as if to drive the lesson deeper. "You threw away the only chance we had at some money." Lila backed up but didn't drop her gaze. "It was just a baby," she whispered, "and someone threw it away like garbage. I had to save it." The crowd murmured uneasily. Some agreed with her father, others looked away, unwilling to be part of the conflict. No one stepped forward for her. Her father pointed his bottle at her. "You think you're better than me? Better than all of us? You think your pity will save you when that animal grows up and kills someone?" "It won't kill anyone," Lila said, her voice cracking. "Dr. Mason will take care of it." At the mention of the wildlife officer, the crowd shifted. A few people exchanged glances, whispers rising. Mason was respected, one of the few outsiders who treated the villagers with courtesy, but respect did little to dampen the anger burning in her father's eyes. "You disobeyed me," he said, stepping closer. "You ran off without permission, and now you come back thinking you're some kind of hero." Lila felt a tremor run through her, but she didn't step back this time. The memory of the cub's cold, trembling body filled her with a strength she didn't fully understand. "If saving a life makes me wrong," she said softly, "then I don't want to be right." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, her father seemed stunned. His mouth opened as if to shout, but no sound came. Instead, he hurled the bottle to the ground, where it shattered into glittering shards. "Get inside," he growled, "before I drag you in." Lila hesitated, then stepped past him, her heart pounding. She entered the shack, feeling the walls close in around her once more. But something inside her had changed. She was no longer a girl who simply endured. She had chosen to fight for a creature smaller and weaker than herself, for a life that deserved a chance. She didn't know yet that the world would soon test that bravery far more brutally than she imagined. For the next several days, Lila lived in a state of restless anticipation. Each morning, before the sun rose, she slipped out of the shack while her father slept off the previous night's anger. She followed the same dusty road toward the outpost, her heart pounding every step of the way. She didn't know whether the cub would survive another day, and the uncertainty gnawed at her like an open wound. The first morning she arrived, Dr. Mason was already outside, adjusting equipment near one of the trailers. When he saw her approaching, his stern face softened a little. "You're back," he said. "I figured you would be." "Is he alive?" Lila asked, breathless. Mason nodded. "Barely. But he's fighting." Relief washed over her so suddenly she had to steady herself. Mason led her inside, and there, on a padded bed surrounded by blankets, lay the cub. It was still thin, its ribs still visible, but its eyes were open, truly open, and watching her with a fragile curiosity. Its breathing was steadier, its tiny chest rising and falling with newfound strength. Lila stepped closer, afraid any sudden movement might frighten it. But when she knelt beside the bed, the cub let out a soft, croaking sound and reached its head toward her. She hesitated, then slowly extended her hand. Its warm, rough tongue brushed her fingers. A small, stunned smile spread across her face. "He remembers you," Mason said quietly. "You were the first thing he saw that wasn't darkness." Lila swallowed hard, emotion tightening her throat. She stayed by the cub's side for nearly an hour that day, gently stroking its fur while Mason checked charts, prepared formula, and cleaned its wounds. When she left, she felt a warmth in her chest that made the walk home a little easier. The next day, the cub tried to stand. Its legs wobbled, and it collapsed almost immediately, but Lila gasped with joy. Mason shook his head with an amused smile. "He's got spirit," he said. "I'll give him that." By the 5th day, the cub could drink from a small bowl. When Lila entered, it let out a squeaky sound almost like a greeting and stumbled toward her. She sat cross-legged on the floor, and it crawled into her lap, curling into a warm ball of fur. She lifted it gently, marveling at how much stronger it felt. "Look at you," she whispered. "You're really trying, aren't you?" The cub nuzzled her chin in response. From that moment forward, something unspoken grew between them, a bond stitched from shared survival, from fear and hope and the strange kindness that had led a girl with nothing to save a creature with even less. The cub followed her with its eyes whenever she moved. When she spoke, its ears twitched as if memorizing her voice. And each time she prepared to leave, it whimpered softly, inching toward her until Mason gently nudged it back. "He's imprinting on you," Mason told her one afternoon. "You were there when he was at his weakest. That kind of attachment doesn't fade easily." Lila looked down at the cub nestled against her leg. "Is that bad?" "Not bad," Mason said. "Just complicated. We'll need to train him to survive in the wild someday. But for now, your presence is giving him the will to live." Lila didn't fully understand the weight of his words. She only knew that when she was with the cub, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, purpose. And when the cub pressed its small head against her chest, she felt something even rarer, love. As the days passed, the villagers began whispering again. They saw Lila walking the road each morning, returning each afternoon with dust in her hair and hope in her eyes. Some said she was foolish, others said she was cursed, but a few began to look at her differently, with quiet respect they had never offered before. One evening, as she prepared to leave the outpost, Mason placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's alive because of you," he said. "Not because of me, not because of luck, because you refused to walk away." Lila didn't know how to respond. She simply looked at the cub, who was wobbling toward her with determined steps, and felt her heart swell. She had saved him, and in some small, unexpected way, he was beginning to save her too. The morning, everything changed, began like all the others. The sun had barely risen when Lila hurried down the dusty path, her heart already lifting at the thought of seeing the cub. She had begun to imagine a future where he grew strong under her watch, where she could visit him every day, where the world would allow them this one miracle. But when she arrived at the outpost, something felt wrong. Mason was standing outside the trailer, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The moment he saw her, a shadow passed across his face. Lila slowed her steps, unease creeping up her spine. "What's wrong?" she asked. Mason exhaled slowly. "Lila, I need to talk to you." She glanced past him, half expecting to see the cub's curious eyes peeking out from the trailer window, but everything was still. "I don't understand," she said. "Is he sick again?" "No," Mason replied. "He's doing well, better than we hoped." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's why this is happening sooner than I expected." Lila's heart thudded. "What's happening?" Mason gestured for her to follow him inside. The cub was there, sitting on a padded mat. When he saw Lila, he scrambled to his feet, letting out an excited chirping sound before stumbling into her arms. She lifted him, feeling the familiar warmth of his small body pressed against her chest. He nuzzled her neck, and she felt a lump rising in her throat. Mason watched them quietly. "The conservation team sent word this morning," he said. "They want him transferred to the main rehabilitation center. It's the only place with the space and resources he needs to learn survival behaviors. If he's ever going to live in the wild, he has to go there." Lila froze. "No," she whispered. "Not yet. He's still small. He still needs me." "I know," Mason said gently. "But this is for his future. If he stays here too long, he'll imprint too deeply on humans. That will make it impossible for him to return to the wild." Lila shook her head, hugging the cub tighter, as if she could protect him from reality. "But he's safe here. He's happy. And I can help." "You already helped," Mason interrupted softly. "You saved his life. But now you have to let him grow without depending on you." His words struck her like a physical blow. The cub pawed at her shirt, unaware of the storm unfolding around him. Lila buried her face in his warm fur, trying to quiet the rising panic in her chest. "When?" she whispered. "The transport team will arrive this afternoon." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Afternoon. Hours. That was all the time she had left. She felt as though someone had reached into her chest and torn something loose. "No," she said again, her voice trembling. "Please, can't I go with him?" Mason's expression tightened. "The rehabilitation center is restricted. Only trained staff are allowed inside." "But he won't understand," Lila cried. "He'll think I left him, just like his mother." The cub pressed closer to her, sensing her distress. His tiny claws clutched at her shirt as he let out a soft, uncertain whimper. Mason stepped forward and rested a hand on her shoulder. "Lila, sometimes loving something means stepping back. He has a chance to become what he was meant to be. A lion, a wild one." The words echoed through her like an unwanted truth. She spent the next few hours sitting beside the cub, memorizing everything about him, the faint spots still speckling his coat, the way his ears flicked when she whispered, the little rumbling sound he made when he fell asleep against her. She held him until her arms ached, until her tears dampened his fur. When the transport truck arrived, she felt her heart crack in a way she hadn't felt since losing her mother. Two handlers entered the trailer with gentle voices and firm hands. The cub resisted at first, clinging to Lila with surprising strength. She tried to hold on to him, but one of the handlers gently pried his paws from her shirt. "No," Lila choked. "Please, let me. I'm sorry," Mason said quietly. The cub let out a piercing cry as he was lifted away. Lila reached for him, but one of the handlers stepped between them. She watched helplessly as they carried him outside and placed him in a secure transport crate, his small face pressed against the metal bars, his eyes wide and frantic. Lila dropped to her knees, her sobs shaking her entire body. The truck door closed. The engine started, and with it, the last piece of her fragile world was carried away. 10 years had passed since the truck carried the cub away. Lila had grown from a small, dust-covered girl into a young woman of 21, with steady hands and eyes that had learned to hide their hurt. The village had changed little, but Lila had changed completely. She no longer walked the dusty road to collect scraps. Instead, she wore the green uniform of a volunteer at the Wildlife Reserve, working alongside the very people who had once saved the cub's life. Her days were filled with tasks checking water stations, clearing brush from the observation paths, documenting tracks. Yet no matter how busy she became, a part of her always drifted back to that tiny creature she had held against her chest. She often wondered if he survived the training, if he grew strong, if he ever roamed the wild with the confidence of a true lion. Mason had told her not to dwell on it, but how could she not? She had poured her heart into saving him, only to watch him vanish behind metal bars. One warm morning, Lila was assigned to join a patrol near the southern ridge of the reserve. The grassland stretched in endless waves of pale gold, and the wind carried the earthy scent of soil and sun-baked plants. She walked beside two rangers, mapping the migration of antelope herds, her boots crunching rhythmically over the dry ground. As they approached a rocky outcrop, one of the rangers paused, scanning the horizon. "Tracks," he said, kneeling beside a fresh imprint. "Large male. Recent." Lila leaned in. The print was massive, the claws deep, the edges crisp. A dominant lion. Her heartbeat quickened, though she didn't know why. They continued up the ridge, moving cautiously. The reserve was home to some of the most powerful predators on the continent. Encounters were rare, but never taken lightly. When they reached the top, the world seemed to expand beneath them. Plains stretched endlessly, dotted with acacia trees and herds grazing lazily under the morning sun. For a moment, Lila simply breathed it in this landscape that was harsh yet beautiful, wild yet forgiving. Then the ranger beside her stiffened. "Below," he whispered. Lila followed his gaze. At the base of the ridge, emerging from a cluster of thorn bushes, was a gigantic lion. His mane burned like gold in the sunlight, thick and radiant, framing a powerful body built from years of survival. His movements were fluid, confident, commanding. He was the undisputed ruler of this land. The rangers tensed immediately. "We should back away slowly," one murmured. "He's too close." But before they could move, the lion lifted his head and stared directly at Lila, not at the group, not at their weapons, at her. A strange stillness settled over the ridge. Lila froze, breath trapped in her throat. Something in the lion's eyes, amber, intense, unwavering, held her in place. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was something else, something she couldn't name. The lion took a step forward. The rangers panicked. "We need to go. Now." But Lila didn't move. Her legs refused to obey. Her heart pounded, but not with terror. She felt something rising inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Recognition. The lion closed the distance slowly, deliberately, his massive paws silent against the earth. The rangers raised their arms, shouting warnings, but the lion didn't even glance at them. His eyes stayed locked on Lila. He stopped only a few feet away. Dust swirled around them in the warm breeze. Time seemed to hold its breath. And then the impossible happened. The lion lowered his enormous head and pressed it gently against her leg. Lila's breath shattered. Her vision blurred, because in that moment she knew. He remembered. For a long moment, Lila stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think, overwhelmed by the weight of what was happening. The lion, this towering, magnificent creature, rested his head against her leg with the same trust, the same fragile tenderness she had once known from a tiny cub fighting for life in her arms. The rangers shouted for her to step away, but their voices felt distant, muffled by the pounding in her ears. Lila slowly lowered herself to the ground, her movements steady, deliberate, respectful. The lion lifted his head to follow her, watching every motion with an intensity that made her chest tighten. When she sat, he moved closer, lowering his huge body onto the earth beside her. Dust rose around them in soft swirls as he lay down, stretching out his long limbs with the slow, assured grace of a king unafraid of anything. Then, with a quiet rumble, he pressed his massive head against her lap. The sound broke something inside her. Her hands trembled as she lifted them, touching the coarse, sun-warmed mane she had only imagined in her dreams. She felt the power beneath his skin, the strength he had grown into, the life he had carved out in the wild. But beneath it all, she felt the same steady heartbeat she had once pressed her fingers against when he was barely clinging to life. "I can't believe it's you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You survived. You really survived." The lion closed his eyes, letting out a deep, resonant exhale that vibrated through the earth. It sounded like relief, like recognition, like home. The rangers approached cautiously, but Mason, who had arrived after being alerted by radio, raised a hand to stop them. He studied the scene with eyes wide, stunned. "I don't understand," one ranger whispered. "Why isn't he attacking?" Mason swallowed hard, awe softening his voice. "Because he knows her." Lila kept her hands gently stroking the lion's mane, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. She remembered every moment of those early days, the shivering body she held close, the desperate cries, the fragile breaths, the quiet nights she spent whispering to him that he wasn't alone. She had always wondered if he ever felt that love again after they were separated. Now she had her answer. After several minutes, the lion lifted his head. He studied her with ancient, soulful eyes, as if searching the memories buried deep inside him to make sure she was real. Then he rubbed his cheek against her shoulder, and a broken laugh escaped her through the tears. "You came back to me," she whispered. "After everything, you came back." The lion stood slowly, towering above her once more. For a moment he looked out over the plains, surveying his kingdom. Then he turned back to Lila and bowed his head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. A gesture of respect, a gesture of gratitude, the kind only given once in a lifetime. Mason stepped forward, voice gentle. "Lila, this is extraordinary. He should fear humans. Instead, he trusts you more than he trusts his own kind." Lila rose to her feet, wiping her cheeks. She looked at the lion, feeling her heart settle into something calm, profound, and whole. "I didn't save him," she said quietly. "Not really. I just gave him a chance. He did the rest." The lion huffed softly, as if agreeing. They stood like that for another long moment, girl and lion, bound by something deeper than nature, stronger than time. Then, with a final brush of his mane against her hand, he turned toward the savannah. Lila watched, her eyes shining, as he walked back into the golden grass, the king returning to his realm. But before he disappeared completely, he stopped and looked back at her one last time, a silent promise, a final goodbye, and then he was gone. Lila stood alone on the ridge, the wind tugging gently at her hair, but she didn't feel alone. Her heart was full of grief, of gratitude, of wonder, and of the knowing that some connections never fade, no matter the distance, no matter the years. Some hearts never forget.